Hello, I'm Rashmi Cockthwaite, Programme Lead for Education at the Council for Disabled Children. We are the national expert body on children's rights and disability, and we've worked closely with the Department for Education to create this training, not just to build staff knowledge, but to help schools turn that understanding into real action. This session is for senior leaders and senior leadership teams, those responsible for planning how the Equality Act training will be delivered in your school, and more importantly, how it becomes part of how your school works. Across your teams, you'll see 4 distinct units with reflection points and takeaway tasks. But this leadership unit is slightly different. It's designed to help you make sense of the whole picture and plan what happens next. We'll cover 3 main areas: a guide to what's in the 4 training units, how to plan and deliver them in your setting, and how to embed the learning into strategic planning and improvement work. You can use this unit however it suits your context. Dip in and out, go in order, or start where you have the most energy and traction. Before we begin, take a moment to reflect. When training lands well in your school, what's made the difference? And when it hasn't, what's got in the way? That's a useful starting point for how you approach this work.
Welcome to this introductory leadership unit. It's designed to support you, the senior leaders, in planning how to deliver the Equality Act training in your school. The staff training itself is about the duties schools hold under the Equality Act 2010 towards disabled pupils. However, this leadership unit is different. It's here to help you think about how best to bring that training into your school. Getting started. As we mentioned, this leadership unit is about the how you plan for the Equality Act training in your school, so it lands really well with staff and connects to your existing priorities. It's designed to meet you where you are. You might just be starting to plan, you might be ready to schedule delivery, or you might even be thinking about how to embed the training more widely. Wherever you are in that process, this unit gives you practical ways forward. Here you'll find everything you need to 1. Understand what's in the 4 Equality Act training units for staff so you can talk about the training with clarity. 2. Work out how to deliver them in a way that suits your school. 3. Connect the training to your school's improvement goals so it strengthens work already underway. And 4. Build a more inclusive school culture for disabled pupils. The purpose is to help you plan in a way that means the training becomes part of the way your school works, not a separate strand. This unit is structured into 3 practical sections. The first section is a guide to the 4 Equality Act training units for staff, so you can see what each covers and how they stand alone. Each unit is designed to work independently, so you can choose the best starting point for your staff. The second section takes you through how to plan and deliver that training in your school, so thinking about timing, delivery methods, and how it connects to your existing priorities. The third section focuses on embedding change, using the training to strengthen your strategic leadership, check impact, and build whole school inclusion. Use the sections as a starting point. You don't have to follow them in order. You can explore them in whichever sequence meets your school's needs most strongly. It's important to note that there are comprehensive resources available to support you. The Council for Disabled Children has produced a family of Equality Act guides that underpin this training. They're grounded in legislation and statutory guidance and provide full explanations, examples, and practical tools. The Teacher's Guide focuses on what school staff need to know and do day to day. The Governors and Trustees Guide sets out strategic responsibility and includes detailed checkpoints to support review and accountability. The Accessibility Plans Handbook offers practical advice with templates and action planning tools. The Early Years Guide ensures the same principles are embedded from the start of education. And finally, for colleges and 16 to 19 academies, the Further Education Guides set out the disability duties for post-16 education. They mirror the same legal framework and principles, but apply them in a further education context. A question that often gets asked is, when it comes to the Equality Act duties for schools, who's responsible? It's the responsible body for the school that has responsibility for the duties in the Act. What that means in practice? Well, it means the responsible body holds the legal responsibility for ensuring the school meets its duties under the Act, and it's ultimately the entity that can be held accountable if a school fails to meet its obligations. The responsible body also has responsibility for the actions of its employees while working for the school, and for agents working on its behalf. So, for example, if a school hires an external sports coach to run lessons or after-school clubs, the responsible body is legally accountable for ensuring that coach's actions comply with the Act, specifically their duties towards disabled pupils. This accountability means the responsible body must take all reasonable steps to make sure that employees and agents understand that they must not discriminate. So who is the responsible body? Well, in a maintained school, it's usually the governing body. But where the local authority itself has responsibility for a specific function, like some aspects of admissions, then the local authority is the responsible body for that function. In an academy, it's the proprietor, which is the academy trust. In an independent school, it's the proprietor. And in a pupil referral unit, it's the local authority. Whilst the institutional responsibilities lie with the responsible body, teachers also have their own professional duties. The teachers' standards require teachers to have an understanding of and always act within the statutory frameworks which set out their professional duties and responsibilities. Those standards explicitly include duties under the Equality Act. However, it isn't just teachers. All staff, teaching, support, non-teaching, must understand and act within the Equality Act. Everyday actions are part of how the school meets its legal duties. When we say acting within the Equality Act, we mean actively avoiding discrimination and other prohibited conduct, and anticipating and making reasonable adjustments for disabled pupils. So, as leaders, you set the tone, helping staff understand these duties and feel confident putting them into practice every day. Section 1. A Guide to the 4 Training Units. The Equality Act training for staff is made up of 4 units. Unit 1, Knowing Who's Disabled. Unit 2, Avoiding Discrimination. Unit 3, Strategic Duties. And Unit 4, A Whole School Approach to the Equality Act. Each unit includes a practical follow-up activity to support staff in applying the Learn It from that unit. Each training unit is designed to last around 45 to 55 minutes. They can be shortened or split if needed, but they're most effective when run in full. The units can be completed in any order, so you can begin where your school needs it most. And to help embed the learning, each unit includes reflection points throughout and end-of-unit takeaway activities. All of these things can be completed individually, in pairs, in small groups, or as a whole team, depending on what works best in your setting. You can decide how much to use them, but the more staff engage with the activities, the stronger the impact will be. And importantly, the training reinforces a shared principle. Inclusion is everyone's responsibility. Every member of staff has a role in removing barriers for disabled pupils, not just the SENCO or senior leaders. Unit 1 is titled Knowing Who's Disabled. This unit helps all staff to understand the definition of disability, recognise who may count as disabled, even without a diagnosis, consider how school culture affects disclosure, and shift from waiting for a label to removing barriers. As a leadership team, you might start by asking, how many disabled pupils do we think there might be in our school? And would all staff recognise them as disabled under the Equality Act? Thinking through these questions can help you shape the training to your context and highlight where staff may need to broaden their understanding. Unit 2 is titled Avoiding Discrimination. This unit helps all staff to understand the different forms of disability discrimination, recognise where the Equality Act applies across school life, understand when and how to make reasonable adjustments, and spot policies or practices that risk discrimination. As leaders, you could ask yourselves, how many of our staff could confidently explain all the different ways a school might discriminate? Framing it this way helps you see where confidence levels vary and where this unit will strengthen consistency across your staff team. Unit 3 is titled Strategic Duties. This unit helps school leaders and staff to understand the duties on accessibility plans and the public sector equality duty, what equality objectives are and why they matter, the importance of partnership working with families, local authorities and professionals, that treating disabled pupils more favourably is not only lawful but sometimes essential, and the benefits of planning strategically for inclusion. Here's a tip to keep in mind as you think about this unit. Staff may not always see themselves as part of strategic duties, but they are a really important part. Use this unit to show how everyone plays a role, through what's on display, what's discussed in meetings, how families are welcomed, and how change is planned and reviewed. These duties only work when they're understood by everyone, and when staff can see how accessibility plans and equality objectives connect to their daily decisions. Unit 4 is titled A Whole School Approach. This unit helps all staff to understand how embedding the Equality Act reduces discrimination and builds a sense of belonging. It helps them work together to make inclusion everyone's responsibility, spot how practice can remove or reinforce barriers, and apply this learning to everyday decisions and routines. Another leader tip: use this unit to step back and consider your school's culture. How well does it already reflect the Equality Act, and where could it be strengthened further? Thinking about ethos, policies and day-to-day routines will help ensure inclusion is lived out in every part of school life. Section 2. Planning and delivering the training in your school. Start by involving the responsible body. The responsible body holds the legal responsibility for meeting the Equality Act duties, and as a reminder, that means the governing body usually in a maintained school, the academy trust in an academy, the proprietor in an independent school, and the local authority in a pupil referral unit. For maintained schools and academies, the SEND Code of Practice states that there should be a member of the governing body or a subcommittee with specific oversight of arrangements for pupils with SEN and disability. It advises that school leaders should regularly review how expertise and resources used for SEN can be used to strengthen the quality of whole school provision as part of ongoing school improvement. So why involve them early? Because it builds shared ownership. When the responsible body understands what you're planning and why, it increases their confidence in your leadership and the direction the school's taking. They'll want to see how your accessibility plan, school improvement plan, and CPD strategy all fit together. These are the documents they naturally rely on to show that the school's planning ahead, embedding inclusion, and supporting staff confidence. Sharing these gives them the reassurance that there's a clear, joined-up plan and evidence that it's being acted upon. Often, training itself will be written into the accessibility plan as one of its objectives. That means the responsible body will be reviewing and approving the plan and monitoring its delivery. And finally, when the responsible body really understands the purpose and impact of training, they can become one of its strongest champions, helping to explain it to staff, parents, and the wider community, and showing that inclusion is a leadership priority across the school. There are natural points in the school year where Equality Act training fits without adding extra load, and where involving the responsible body makes the process smoother. When you're reviewing the accessibility plan, training is often one of the actions the school's already committed to. So, for example, if the plan includes improving access to school trips, staff training on inclusive visit planning can sit naturally within that review. When the school improvement plan or CPD plan is being updated, this is a really good moment to align Equality Act training with priorities you're already working on. For example, linking training to behaviour or attendance goals where participation or inclusion is part of that picture. When you're looking at staff development needs, gaps in staff confidence under the Act are a clear prompt to bring the responsible body into the discussion. So if surveys show staff feel less confident making adjustments in PE, that's a point to involve them early. When budgets are being set, agreeing resources for training alongside other strategic decisions helps ensure training is planned for rather than added on as an afterthought. And finally, when reviewing progress and impact, evidence of staff learning can be part of what you report back, whether that's improved confidence, better participation patterns, or fewer concerns raised about access. These natural touch points give the responsible body a clear view of how training supports the school's wider direction and how it strengthens the anticipatory strategic work already underway. It's not just when you involve the responsible body that matters, it's how. The way you bring them in can make these conversations more constructive and help everyone stay focused on the Equality Act duties. A good starting point is to involve them during your accessibility planning process. Rather than presenting a finished plan, share early drafts, the training aims you're considering, the actions you're proposing, and the timescales you think are realistic. That early consultation builds shared ownership, as we said earlier, and helps avoid decisions feeling predetermined. It's also helpful to bring evidence. If you have information about staff confidence or training needs, perhaps from a short staff survey or feedback from curriculum leads, share it openly. It shows you're basing your proposals on real patterns and real gaps in your school. When you propose training, it's helpful to be clear about the aims, the actions, and the expected impact. This helps the responsible body understand the link between the training and the duties the schools must meet under the Act. Agreeing resources up front is important too, whether it's time in staff meetings, dedicated inset, or a small budget for materials. Confirming this early makes delivery much more achievable. Embedding Equality Act training into your existing plans, such as the School Improvement Plan, the CPD strategy, or the Accessibility Plan, is another way to make sure it doesn't sit in isolation. When training is part of the school's core planning cycle, it has a stronger foundation and much clearer accountability. There are also useful tools you can use together. 2 of CDC's Equality Act guides, the Governors and Trustees Guide and the Accessibility Plan's Handbook, include checkpoints. These are short sets of reflective questions that help schools review how well they're meeting the duties. Using these checkpoints with your responsible body can give structure to discussions and help identify where training is most needed. And finally, keep them updated on progress. Brief, regular updates, for example, that the first units have been completed or that staff are already applying learning. These things help the responsible body see momentum and champion the work confidently. When you're deciding where to begin with the Equality Act training, the most effective place to start is with the priorities your school's already working on. This means you're building training into existing leadership cycles rather than creating something new or separate. The easiest way to get training moving is to connect it to priorities you already have. That way, it doesn't feel like something extra, but part of the work you're already leading. A scheduled review of your accessibility plan is one of the clearest entry points. This is already a statutory requirement, so it's a natural point to build in training. Reviews often highlight where staff confidence needs strengthening, so training can sit naturally within that process. Here's an example. If the plan includes improving access to the curriculum, training subject leaders on adapting schemes of work can be one of the actions built into the review. Planned updates to your school improvement plan or CPD strategy offer another opportunity. Equality Act duties underpin a lot of the work leaders are already doing, from behaviour and attendance to curriculum access and professional development, so the training can line up with those priorities. Staff feedback is also important. Feedback is direct evidence of what staff need. If leaders act on it, it makes the case for training and builds trust. School data plays a role too. Patterns in participation, exclusions, attendance or attainment can help you see where disabled pupils may be facing barriers, and training can support staff to remove those barriers. For example, If data shows disabled pupils are underrepresented in after-school clubs, training can then focus on planning inclusive enrichment activities. And finally, external feedback from Ofsted, tribunal decisions, or parent and carer comments often signals areas where a whole school response is needed. Training is a practical and constructive way to respond to those messages. So the point here is simple. You don't need to create a new agenda item to get this training moving. Connect it to the priorities your school already has. That keeps the work manageable, aligned, and clearly linked to your wider school improvement decisions. When you're leading this work, you'll often need to bring others with you. Colleagues, senior leaders, governors, or the responsible body. It helps when everyone can see how Equality Act training connects directly to what the school is already required to do and what it cares about. Start with your school's legal duties, linking the training to statutory responsibilities, like the accessibility plan, or the duty to make reasonable adjustments, makes the purpose really clear. So, for example, our accessibility plan commits us to improving access to after-school clubs. Staff training on inclusive trip planning is one of the steps that delivers that commitment. Show how the training strengthens existing priorities. People are more open to training when they can see it helps with things they're already working on, whether that's behaviour, curriculum development, staff confidence, or reducing exclusions. For instance, we're already focusing on reducing exclusions. Training on reasonable adjustments will support that priority and help remove barriers for disabled pupils. Reassure colleagues it's not extra work. This isn't about adding more tasks. It's about strengthening how duties are carried out. Training builds confidence and gives staff practical tools, which ultimately reduces pressure and risk. You might say, staff have told us that they spend extra time adapting resources. Training will give them strategies they can use straight away, saving time later. Use evidence to support the case. Data and feedback help people see the need. This could include staff surveys, pupil outcomes, exclusion patterns, behaviour data, or complaints. The aim here is to make the purpose visible and practical, to show that Equality Act training strengthens the school's work and helps everyone meet their responsibilities with confidence. This slide brings the focus back to your own school. At this point, you've seen how the Equality Act duties sit alongside your strategic planning. Now the question is, how does this training connect to what you're already trying to achieve? Ofsted put it plainly in 2023, and it's helpful framing for colleagues. Staff development should link to statutory duties and school priorities, otherwise it's unlikely to drive improvement. That's exactly where Equality Act training sits. It isn't something extra on top of your work. It strengthens how statutory duties are met, and it supports the priorities already shaping your improvement plans. For example, if one of your priorities is strengthening literacy across the curriculum, this training can help staff think about accessible reading materials or removing barriers linked to visual access or processing. Pause the video here and take a moment to note one or two priorities this training connects most strongly to in your setting. If you're watching with colleagues, have a quick conversation. That link is what helps the training land clearly and be taken seriously across the school. When you're ready, press play to continue. This slide is all about how the training actually becomes part of everyday practice. You'll see the first point on the slide reminds us that if training actions sit within your school improvement plan and your accessibility plan, they get reviewed in the same rhythm as everything else. We've touched on the strategic side already, so I want to focus on what helps the learning genuinely stick for staff. The second part of the slide is where that happens. Now, embedding works best when staff meet the learning in familiar places. They could be short discussion slots in staff meetings, supervision, curriculum meetings, or induction. These small, repeated touchpoints help people try something out, notice what changed, and then bring that insight into the next unit. And that's exactly what the graphic on this slide is showing. The train, apply, embed loop is part of the design of the Equality Act training. The real change doesn't happen during the session itself. It happens in the space between units, when staff have time to experiment with an idea, reflect on it, and revisit it in the next session. The takeaway tasks are there to guide that process. This is backed up by wider evidence too. Professional development has the strongest impact when staff have structured space to apply and revisit new learning over time. So the message here is simple. Embedding happens when the training is part of your normal routines and when staff have space between units to try things out and bring their reflections back. And that leads us straight to the next slide, which focuses on keeping the learning alive between sessions. This slide is all about what happens between the training sessions, because that's where confidence grows. Small, simple check-ins keep the learning alive. A question like, "What have we tried?" or "What's changed?" helps staff pause and notice the impact of what they've put into practice. It doesn't need to be formal. It can be a quick moment in a team meeting or a short conversation in the corridor. Giving staff time to reflect is important. People often need a bit of space after each unit to think about how the Equality Act applies in their role. You might build that in through a short agenda item in a meeting, or by inviting staff to bring one reflection or one example to the next session. And don't forget the takeaway activities. They're designed to bridge the gap between sessions. Using them in meetings, even briefly, helps keep a shared focus on removing barriers for disabled pupils. The final point on this slide really matters. Noticing and celebrating small inclusive changes helps staff see the value of what they're doing. It might be a pupil joining a club for the first time, a smoother transition at lunchtime, or a practical adjustment that made a lesson more accessible. Highlighting these moments really helps build momentum. Here, we offer ideas about who might contribute to the Equality Act training. It's not a checklist and it's not a set of fixed roles. Every school is different, so think of these as possibilities you can shape to your own context. Senior leadership often helps set the direction and make sure time is protected in the calendar, but that doesn't mean they have to lead every element. In some schools, that role might be shared. CPD or inset leads might help pace the training within wider development plans, keeping everything joined up. In other settings, this might sit with an assistant head, a phase lead or a curriculum coordinator. Senkos and inclusion leads bring valuable insight into the lived experience of disabled pupils and where day-to-day barriers appear. Their perspective helps ground the training in real practice, but again, schools may draw on pastoral leads or behaviour leads too. Middle leaders can play a role by reinforcing messages in their teams, connecting the training to subject planning or pastoral routines. Some schools do this through year leads, others through department leads or team coordinators. And finally, involving a nominated governor or trustee can help build a connection back to governance, making sure the responsible body can see how the training supports the Equality Act duties. But how that involvement looks will vary from school to school. The key message here is simple. You don't have to carry this alone. There are different ways to build a team around the training, and you can draw on the strengths and structures that make sense for your school. Here, we're recognising why leaders often need support at this point in the process, and why that support matters. When the training doesn't clearly link to a current priority, it risks slipping behind other demands. Schools are navigating a lot, so connecting the Equality Act training to work that's already underway helps keep it relevant and visible. The second point is about the responsible body. What staff notice during the training, the barriers they identify, or the adjustments they're trialling, often provides useful evidence about where further action might be needed. Leaders can draw on that insight to support the responsible body in fulfilling its duties. It also helps when colleagues reinforce the right message, that this training isn't an add-on. Understanding and applying Equality Act duties is part of everyday decision-making in schools. When leaders feel supported in framing it that way, staff can see the relevance much more easily. When we think about getting staff on board, the most important thing is helping people see the purpose and where they fit into it. Staff engage when they understand that the Equality Act is about real pupils, real decisions, and what happens in classrooms, corridors, trips and clubs every day. Starting with the why makes a big difference. When colleagues hear how the Act links to pupil experiences, avoiding discrimination anticipating adjustments, removing barriers, the training becomes meaningful rather than abstract. It also helps to reassure staff that this is something they already do. Many are already making day-to-day adjustments, providing printed notes for a pupil with a visual impairment, checking noise levels in a lesson, or adapting instructions. The training simply gives a shared legal framework for decisions they're already making. Relevance matters too. Every role contributes to removing barriers. Teaching staff, lunchtime supervisors, office staff, pastoral teams, everyone acting on behalf of the school. When people see how the duties apply in their context, confidence grows. Early examples can help you build momentum. If someone's tried a takeaway task, even something small, like adjusting a routine or noticing where a pupil hesitates to take part, sharing that helps colleagues connect the training to real practice. And finally, inviting curiosity helps create the culture you want. Staff need space to bring questions or scenarios they're unsure about. This isn't about judgment, it's about exploring the duties together as part of improving inclusion across the whole school. You've got flexibility in how you deliver the training. The Equality Act duties apply to everyone in the school, but you can choose the format that works for your setting. You could run it in an inset, a twilight, or weave it into a regular staff meeting. The important thing is it fits with rhythms staff are already used to. You might want to do some of it as a whole group to set a shared message, or in smaller teams so staff can connect it directly to their role. For example, lunchtime supervisors meeting to think about adjustments in the lunch hall, corridors or playground. And for new starters or those who miss a session, self-directed learning can also be a useful option. It doesn't have to be either or with delivery. Combining online and in-person often works best. Online means staff can go back and review. In-person is where you might apply it to your school context. And don't forget induction and refresher cycles. Embedding it there means every new member of staff starts with an understanding of school's duties towards disabled pupils, and nobody misses out just because they weren't in the room the first time. Now take a minute to think about the delivery models we've just looked at. Which of them would work best for different groups of staff in your setting? There isn't a right or wrong model here. What matters is that it works for your school, for the way your staff work, the time you have available, and the priorities you're focusing on. This training doesn't need to be led by just one person. In fact, it often works better when the team plans together how it will be introduced and shared. The principle here is about drawing on the strengths across your staff group. Pooling strengths. Think about who brings different areas of knowledge, whether that's curriculum, pastoral care, policy, data or inclusion. Different expertise will give the training a stronger foundation. Bringing in different voices. It makes a real difference when staff hear from both teaching and non-teaching colleagues, or when junior and senior staff share perspectives. It shows that the Equality Act applies across all roles in school life. Sharing delivery. Some schools co-facilitate or rotate who introduces each session. This spreads ownership rather than placing the responsibility on one leader. Using what's already working. Link to existing CPD or pupil voice roles. If there are already staff leading on behaviour, safeguarding or curriculum development, weave the training into those structures, valuing lived experience. If you have disabled staff or staff with caring responsibilities who want to contribute, their perspective can add real insight into how the training connects to everyday practice. The important thing is that delivery is a shared responsibility, planned together as a team so it draws on the strengths you already have. And once you've decided who's leading what, the next step is thinking about how the learning continues between sessions. That's where the takeaway tasks come in. Each unit ends with a short practical task that staff can try out in their own contexts. These tasks act as a bridge between the sessions, helping colleagues spot where barriers appear in real situations and giving them a manageable way to trial inclusive ideas straight away. Now, because the tasks sit within the routines staff already know, like lessons, playground duties, trips, lunchtime roles, office tasks, people can see what a small change looks like in practice. The example on the slide shows that clearly. A simple shift in a seating plan helps two pupils settle more easily. Small adjustments can have a noticeable impact. These tasks also help teams learn from each other. When colleagues share what they've tried, it builds a picture of what's working across the school and helps the next unit feel more connected to real experience. And for leaders, these examples are valuable too. They show where staff are already removing barriers and where more adjustments might be needed. That insight supports both day-to-day decisions and the school's wider planning. Alongside the practical takeaway tasks, the reflection prompts offer something slightly different. They help staff pause and make sense of what they're noticing. These prompts are designed to open up short, considered conversations, the kind that help colleagues connect the Equality Act duties to the way decisions are made in their part of the school. It's less about trying something new and more about thinking carefully about what certain decisions mean for disabled pupils. Because the prompts are framed around the duties themselves, they help staff build a shared language, whether that's about avoiding discrimination, anticipating adjustments, or spotting where a provision, criterion, or practice might be creating an unintended barrier. Over time, that shared language helps teams talk about inclusion with more confidence. The prompts also help surface patterns. People begin to notice where things tend to work well and where barriers appear repeatedly, such as at certain times of day, in particular routines, or in specific activities. Those insights can be really valuable when you're planning ahead. And these reflections don't need long slots. Even a brief discussion in a team meeting can be enough to help colleagues step back, join the dots, and bring a slightly deeper understanding into the next unit. Now that you've seen how takeaway tasks and reflection prompts help staff build the learning between units, the next step is to picture how the training could sit across your school year. You might be thinking at this point, how can we fit this training into an already busy year? As a reassuring reminder, the key is to see it as a process, not a one-off event. You don't have to do everything at once. The points on this slide are really here to help you picture what a manageable rhythm might feel like across the year. They're not new ideas, you'll recognise some of them from earlier, but this is the moment to bring them together and think about them as part of the whole pattern. Spacing the sessions simply means you're giving your staff a bit of breathing room between units. It helps you avoid trying to squeeze everything into one half term, and it gives the training a natural cadence across the year. Building in time to trial the takeaway tasks and revisit ideas is less about adding extra meetings and more about noticing where the natural spaces already exist for those conversations to happen. For example, points when teams naturally regroup or look ahead. And the reminder to align with what's already happening isn't about adding anything new. It's about choosing places in the year that already make sense for you. Every school's rhythm is different, so what you're really looking for is the version that feels sustainable. On the next slide, I'll show you one example of how that rhythm could look, just to help you start imagining what might work in your setting. Here's an example of how a delivery rhythm might work across the year. As I said, it's here to spark ideas. Every school will need to shape its own plan. In this model, Unit 1 is introduced in September on inset. Unit 2 follows in a staff meeting. Then there's a reflection slot in January before Unit 3 in the spring, and Unit 4 towards the end of the year. Notice how there's space built in for reflection and application mid-year. That gap is deliberate. It's when staff can trial takeaway tasks and build them into practice. The important thing is that the rhythm feels realistic in your setting. It's better to plan fewer, well-spaced sessions that stick than to rush through them all at once. As we start shaping how this training will work in your school, it can help to bring together some of the practical questions we've touched on throughout this section. There's nothing new here. This slide simply gathers the key pieces you'll want to think about when turning the ideas into a workable plan. You might begin with who could introduce each unit. As we said before, different colleagues bring different strengths, and you don't need the same person every time. Then think about when each unit could sit across your year. Look at your natural rhythm, the points when staff already come together or when you review aspects of practice. You'll also need to decide how each unit will be delivered. That might be whole group facilitation, a peer-led approach, or self-directed learning with a follow-up conversation. It's worth noting any practical support you'll need, whether that's time, technology, communication with staff and the responsible body, or space between sessions. And finally, think about who needs to be involved from the start. Depending on your school, that could include middle leaders, governors, trustees, a proprietor, the local authority, admin or HR colleagues, or family and pupil voice. The aim here isn't to finalise anything, it's simply to bring the right questions into one place so you can shape a plan that feels doable and meaningful for your setting. This is your end of section 2 takeaway task. Use this slide as a working template to start shaping how your school will deliver the training. As a team, take 10 to 15 minutes now to sketch out your first thoughts. Work through the questions in the grid. What needs planning? Jot down the broad approach. Will you use inset, staff meetings, or smaller group sessions, or a combination? Who will introduce each unit? Draw on the strengths across your staff team. So it could be your Senko, a designated safeguarding lead, pastoral lead, or someone else with relevant expertise. When will it happen? Fit it into the natural rhythm of your year. CPD days, team meetings, or induction slots. How will it be delivered? Whole group? Peer-led? Self-directed with follow-up discussions? Decide what makes sense in your setting. What support or resources are needed? This could include printed slides, technology access, or time in meetings. You might also think about how you'll keep governors, or trustees, proprietor or local authority, depending on your school type, in the loop. How will success be shared or reviewed? Build in feedback mechanisms. They could be surveys, informal discussions, reflections from takeaway tasks, changes in staff confidence or practice, or hearing from pupils and families about any noticeable impact. Pause the video now, work through the grid together, and start shaping what will make this training doable and meaningful in your school. Press play when you're ready to return. Welcome back! Hopefully you've had a chance to sketch out the beginnings of a delivery plan with your team. Remember, this is a working draft. The aim wasn't to finish the polished plan today, but to capture first ideas that make sense for your setting. The next step is to test and refine what you've drafted. Try it out in practice. Run one unit or one staff session and see how it feels. Gather feedback from staff. Notice changes in staff confidence or practice. And keep an ear out for feedback from pupils or families on any difference they've seen. Adjust as you go so your plan becomes more realistic and more meaningful over time. This way, your delivery plan isn't a static document. It's a tool you adapt as you learn what works best for your staff. Section 3. Embedding change. Strategic leadership, impact and whole school inclusion. We've now reached the third part of this unit, which looks at embedding change. This is about the leadership role in making sure the training has impact and that it strengthens whole school inclusion over time. Training only makes a difference when leaders create space for it to be acted on. Staff are far more likely to take the training seriously if they know their ideas will be heard and put into practice. The first example here shows how a simple takeaway activity can feed straight into strategic work. Staff reflections led to updates to the accessibility plan, and for the team involved, it was the first time the document had genuinely felt alive, something they were shaping together rather than something sitting on a shelf somewhere. The second example shows the power of reflection prompts in everyday routines. A quick look at break time spaces uncovered a noisy area that some pupils were avoiding. A small change created a quieter social space. A practical adjustment rooted directly in what staff noticed. These examples aren't about big overhauls. They're about leaders creating the conditions for staff thinking to travel somewhere useful. So it's worth pausing for a moment. What approach could you build into your own planning to show staff that their input leads to real change? It could be as simple as a regular slot to review what's been noticed, or a commitment to act on one takeaway from each unit. Even small structures like that signal to staff that their reflections matter. By this point in the unit, we've seen how the training builds a shared understanding across the school. But for that understanding to translate into meaningful change, it needs leadership attention and leadership follow-through. The Equality Act duties aren't add-ons or something separate from your school's core work. They shape the policies you write, the curriculum pupils experience, the routines that structure the school day, and the values that guide your community. As we've said throughout this unit, the legal responsibility for these duties sits with the responsible body. But leadership is what gives those duties practical force. It's leadership that turns statutory responsibilities held by the responsible body into the everyday decisions, conversations, and reviews that remove barriers for disabled pupils. That's where this training fits in. It gives staff a shared foundation, a common way of thinking about anticipating adjustments, avoiding discrimination, and noticing where a provision, criterion, or practice may be creating barriers. Leadership is what helps that foundation land in the right places. Policy cycles, curriculum review, staff development, and whole school planning. So, before we move on to look at the strategic documents that can carry this work forward, it's worth pausing to consider, where does this sit within your own leadership agenda? And how might your role help the responsible body fulfil its duties effectively and confidently? Using the training to review strategic documents. These documents are where your Equality Act duties are made visible. Starting with the accessibility plan. Every school must have a written plan to improve access for disabled pupils. The reflections staff share through the training can help you spot genuine barriers, whether that's in the curriculum, the environment, or how information is shared. It's also a good point in the cycle to check your plan is updated within the statutory 3-year window and to refresh the actions so the plan feels live and responsive. Then there's your equality information and objectives for maintained schools, academies and pupil referral units under the public sector equality duty. The training can help you review whether your current equality objectives are still reducing disadvantage. If they're more than 4 years old or no longer reflect the issues staff are raising, it may be time to update them. And finally, CPD and your school improvement plan. These aren't statutory, but they're often the documents that shape daily practice. Staff reflections and feedback can help you align future CPD with your inclusion goals. They can also highlight where duties under the Act need to be more visible in whole school planning, or where there might be follow-up needs or gaps. A helpful leadership prompt here is, which of these strategic documents could you strengthen this year, using what staff are learning through the training? And to make sure this training leads to real change, it helps to notice and capture the impact as it happens. This slide highlights 4 simple but helpful ways. First, listen to what staff share. The takeaway tasks are designed to draw out examples from everyday practice. So staff might say, I tried a different way of grouping pupils and it reduced barriers in my classroom. Those small insights tell you where the training is already shifting practice. Second, review 1 or 2 policies or plans. You don't need to take on everything at once. Focus on a key document, like your accessibility plan or behaviour policy. Ask, has the training given us new insights we can use to strengthen it? 3. Build in a checkpoint. Agree a time to pause and reflect with your team or your responsible body. A short discussion on what shifted, what needs more work, helps to keep the learning alive and stops it slipping off the agenda. 4. Capture small wins. Notice when a classroom adjustment or change in routine removes a barrier for a pupil. Those small changes matter. They're really visible evidence of progress. Now this brings us to a pause and reflect moment. Looking 6 months ahead, what would good progress look like in your school? Think about the changes you'd hope to see in practice, in policies, and in those small but important wins for pupils. Hold those hopes in mind as we move on. They'll make it easier to notice when the work is starting to make a difference. Before we look at the actions on this slide, Just a quick note on the terminology. When I use the term governors here, I'm including trustees, proprietors, or the appropriate local authority representatives, depending on who the responsible body is in your setting. This slide brings those people into the picture because there are a few practical steps leaders can take to make sure the training is supported at that level and has the space to influence whole school planning. First, brief governors early. A short early conversation helps them understand what the training covers and how it supports the responsible body to meet its duties under the Act. It sets the tone that this is part of your school's strategic work, not just an isolated CPD session. You may also find it helpful to invite a governor to observe part of the training or to be involved in reviewing follow-up activities. It gives them a sense of the training in context, and it strengthens their ability to ask informed, supportive questions later on. Next, record the training in your strategic documents. Include it in CPD plans, your school improvement plan, or in equality reviews. Doing this anchors the training in your ongoing improvement cycle, rather than leaving it as a standalone event. And finally, frame as a strategic CPD. It builds staff confidence to recognise and remove barriers and to act within the Equality Act duties. That directly supports the responsible body in fulfilling its responsibilities towards disabled pupils, which makes this training a strategic investment in your culture, not just an add-on. As you start embedding this training, it's helpful to think ahead to the kinds of questions governors might ask. And when I say governors, I'm also including trustees, proprietors, or the local authority, depending on who the responsible body is in your setting. Their role is to check how well the school is meeting its duties. So the questions you see here aren't about creating extra workload. They're about understanding how the training is being used to remove barriers for disabled pupils and strengthen inclusion over time. They may start with your accessibility plan, asking how insights from the training are feeding into the statutory 3-year cycle and whether actions feel current and meaningful. They'll also want to understand the impact of the training. What are staff doing differently? What shifts are emerging in day-to-day practice? And what are people noticing? Tracking barriers is another common area. Governors may ask how the school is checking whether adjustments are working and how you're noticing where barriers are being reduced or where they persist. Staff confidence is likely to come up too. Expect questions about whether staff feel equipped to recognise discrimination, avoid it in everyday decisions, and act on the duties under the Equality Act. They may also probe how the school is anticipating reasonable adjustments, not just responding once an issue has already arisen. And finally, they may ask how all of this connects with Ofsted's continued focus on inclusion and access, particularly how your approach shows a proactive commitment to removing barriers. So here's your reflection prompt for this slide. How could you prepare your governors to engage confidently with these kinds of questions? That might mean sharing early insights, highlighting quick wins, or building in a moment to discuss what staff are learning. Pause the video now and press play when you're ready to continue. This slide widens the lens a little. Up to this point, we've talked about how the training works and how you might organise it. Here, we're focusing on why embedding a whole school approach really matters. A strong approach to equality helps schools meet Ofsted's expectations. Inspectors look closely at how leaders are complying with their statutory duties under the Equality Act and, where relevant, the public sector equality duty. So the work you do here isn't sitting on the side, it directly connects to those expectations. It also reduces the risk of disability discrimination claims. When equality duties are understood across the school, and when barriers are actively identified and removed, the school is far less exposed to situations that escalate into complaints or challenges. And most importantly, it advances equality. That means disabled pupils being able to participate, achieve, feel safe and thrive alongside their peers as part of everyday life. The Ofsted quote on the slide brings this home. Inspectors assess how well leaders are fulfilling the legal duties that sit across the school, So embedding this training isn't just good practice, it strengthens your school's position legally and educationally. What helps schools meet their duties? Well, the Equality Act duties are much more likely to be met where schools do the following things, where they welcome all children, young people and their families. This is the foundation. It's about starting from a position of belonging, assuming disabled pupils can take part fully and asking how to make that happen, not whether it's possible. When that expectation is clear, staff naturally start looking for solutions rather than limits. Embed values that celebrate difference. This is about the tone leaders set. When diversity and difference are openly valued, in assemblies, policies, conversations and decisions, it shifts the culture. It means equality isn't treated as an extra. It's simply how the school works. Identify and remove barriers through practical solutions. Most barriers don't require major structural change, but they often do involve thoughtful, meaningful adjustments. For example, giving a pupil early access to lesson materials so that they can process information at their own pace. Adapting the way instructions are given so they're clearer and more concrete. Offering alternative ways to take part in a task or assessment, or planning movement around the building so a pupil avoids pain, sensory overload, or unsafe transitions. The key is spotting what's getting in the way, whether that's pace, sensory load, communication demands, physical access, or the way something's organised, and then acting to remove the disadvantage before it becomes a bigger issue. Build strong relationships with disabled pupils and their families. The most effective adjustments are almost always shaped through partnership. Checking in with pupils and families helps you understand what's working and what isn't, and it shows that the school is acting with the right level of care and due regard. Actively seek and listen to pupils' voices. Hearing directly from disabled pupils gives leaders insight that no dataset can offer. It helps schools understand where barriers show up in daily routines and decisions, and it supports more precise adjustments. It also shows that equality considerations are part of everyday leadership, not something separate or occasional. Be ambitious for disabled pupils' outcomes and participation. High expectations matter. Low expectations can become a barrier in themselves. Starting with the assumption that disabled pupils can achieve and participate fully shifts the question from can they to what's getting in the way and how do we remove that barrier. That mindset helps leaders make confident, anticipatory decisions. Ensure staff training and access to the right support. Training gives staff the confidence to recognise when an adjustment might be needed and to act early. And staff can only do that well if they have access to the right support, whether that's clear processes, time to check decisions with colleagues, or knowing who to go to when they're unsure. Training and those organisational supports help show that the school has taken reasonable steps to prevent discrimination. Keep arrangements under regular review as needs change. For the final point on this slide, you'll see that this includes keeping your accessibility plan under review and preparing a new plan at the end of each statutory 3-year cycle. For maintained schools, academies and pupil referral units, it also includes publishing and refreshing equality objectives at least every 4 years. And on a day-to-day level, it's about checking that reasonable adjustments are actually working in practice. This regular review is what shows that the responsible body is treating its duties as a continuous process, not a one-off exercise. And taken together, these behaviours make discrimination much less likely and inclusion much more likely. And they sit at the heart of what the Equality Act expects. This part of the unit is about evidence and accountability, but in a practical, everyday sense. It's about noticing the difference this training is making and being able to show it clearly. One helpful approach is to capture a simple before and after. What did day-to-day practice look like before staff completed a unit? And what do you see now? That might be how a routine now runs in a calmer, more predictable way, how a subject lead has adjusted a scheme of work to remove a particular barrier, or how decisions about trips or activities are being made with equality duties in mind. Those examples don't need to be dramatic. They just need to show that practice is moving in the right direction. It's also helpful to bring together different perspectives. Staff may say they feel more confident, recognising when a barrier might be emerging. Parents or carers may comment that communication feels clearer or easier to navigate. And pupils often tell you in very simple terms whether something feels more accessible or more possible for them. Triangulating those insights gives a much richer picture of impact. Using reflections as evidence. Remember, the reflections and takeaway tasks aren't just for learning, they're useful evidence. Staff often identify barriers through those activities, or they might note where something they tried has made a real difference. Those insights can feed directly into your accessibility plan, reviews, equality objectives, or reports to governors. It helps you draw a clear line from the training to the changes that then follow. All of this matters because the story you tell locally sits within a bigger national picture about outcomes and experiences for disabled pupils, and that's what we'll look at next. This slide is really the why behind the training. When we look at school level data, we can see the scale of the challenge and why staff confidence in the Equality Act duties matters so much. The figures on the slide come from two places: Department for Education data from 2023 to 24 and 2024, and Education Policy Institute analysis from 2024. And it's important to say clearly, these data sets use SEN categories, that is, pupils with an education, health and care plan, or those receiving SEN support. They are not the same as the broader disability definition under the Equality Act, but they do tell us a lot about how pupils most likely to be disabled under the Act are doing in school. If we look at attainment first, we see that by the end of reception, the gap is already almost 20 months. By the end of primary school, it widens again. And by the end of secondary school, pupils with an EHCP are around 40 months behind their peers. That's more than 3 years of learning before they even leave school. Attendance tells a similar story. In 2023 to 24, more than a third of pupils with an EHCP were persistently absent, 35.3%, and just over 30% of those on SEN support. That compares with 19.1% across all pupils. And exclusions remain stark. According to the 2024 EPI analysis, pupils with SEND are up to 5 times more likely to be excluded than their peers. These aren't just statistics. They're signs of the barriers disabled pupils are facing in the system, and they bring us right back to the purpose of this training: helping staff recognise where barriers are, anticipate them earlier, and remove them so pupils can participate and achieve on more equal terms. Now, if the previous slide showed the picture in school, this slide shows us what happens beyond school, the longer term outcomes. You'll notice it uses a mix of data: SEN data from the DFE, Department for Education, and ONS data, Office for National Statistics, which generally uses the Equality Act definition of disability. ONS data shows that 16 to 24-year-olds who are disabled are twice as likely to be NEET. That means not in education, employment or training, compared with their non-disabled peers. Destinations data from the DFE shows that 69% of pupils with SEN were in a sustained education, employment or training destination after 16 to 18 study, and that's compared with 85% of pupils without SEN. So what that means is that 31% of pupils with SEN were not in a sustained destination, compared with 15% of those without SEN. There's also a clear qualifications gap. ONS data shows that 16.1% of disabled people had no qualifications. That's nearly 3 times the rate of 6% for non-disabled people. And loneliness and well-being are major factors too. ONS reports that 13.3% of disabled people said they feel lonely often or always, and that's compared with 3.4% of non-disabled people. The biggest disparity is among young adults, aged 16 to 24. So while these data sets describe different groups, they point in the same direction. Disabled young people are experiencing significant inequalities in education, employment, well-being, and connection. And together, they paint the national picture, the why for this training. Now that you've seen how the whole training fits together, this takeaway activity is your chance to move from reflection to taking action. Throughout this unit, we've talked about barriers, adjustments, and the role that leadership plays in embedding the Equality Act duties. Staff will already have highlighted examples through conversations, observations, reflections, and the takeaway activities. This activity will help you bring that insight together and use it to review one or more areas of your school's strategic practice. You might look at your accessibility plan and ask whether new barriers have been identified through the training. Is your plan driving action, or is it sitting on a shelf? Is it due for review? Where they apply, you could look at your equality objectives. Are they still relevant and embedded in practice? Do they reflect the barriers staff have identified? You might review your CPD strategy and consider whether the training revealed any gaps or misunderstandings. Do staff need follow-up or a chance to explore Equality Act duties in more depth? You could look at policies and day-to-day routines, such as uniform, behaviour or homework. Have any policies been flagged as needing review because they may disadvantage disabled pupils? Are reasonable adjustments being anticipated, planned and embedded into daily routines? And you might look at your evidence of change. How are you capturing examples of what's changed, no matter how small? By sharing those examples, you reinforce progress and show staff that their learning is shaping the school. As I said at the beginning of this slide, this activity is about turning the training into sustained improvement, picking an area, using the feedback staff are already giving you, and identifying where change has begun and where more action might be needed. So this is a good moment to pause the video. Take a few minutes to work through the questions on the slide and begin noting the areas you want to take forward. When you're ready, press play and we'll move into the final part of the session. We've come to the end of this introductory unit from the Council for Disabled Children. Thank you for joining us and for the time and care you've given to thinking through how the Equality Act training will take shape in your school. We hope you're leaving with a clear starting point, something that feels realistic for your setting and gives you the confidence to take the next steps with your team. If you'd like to explore further Equality Act training or bespoke support for your school or trust, you can contact us through our website. Thank you once again for your time and your commitment to inclusion. Wishing you well as you take this work forward.
You've reached the end of this leadership unit. Thank you for taking the time. This training is all about helping you in your role to make sure that the Equality Act duties are understood across the school and also put into practice in the way that staff work, plan and make decisions. But before you move on, take a few minutes to look at the takeaway prompts. They're there to help you think about how the training will be delivered in your setting and what support your teams might need to embed it really well. When staff are clear on what the Equality Act requires of the school, it becomes easier to plan together, reduce barriers and avoid discrimination. Thanks once again.